Okay, excellent. Welcome everybody. We're very excited. This is the our last SAM seminar for 2024. We're very excited to have Amanda Michaud talking about her latest work. So this is, as I said, our last seminar for the year. We're gonna get started with the planning of the next semester. Many thanks, Amanda and Catherine, for being here and presenting your work. Many thanks to our great panelists for giving comments and making this an exciting presentation. So Amanda, you have like 1 hour for the presentation, and the plan is to, this follows for, another 15 minutes of Q&A. If you want to take a couple of minutes of the Q&A, as to conclude, that's always fine. Uh, Floor is yours.
All right, thank you guys so much. I really want to thank the organizers. This is clearly a lot of work and a great public service, so thank you so much. So as Ioana said, Catherine's also here, who is my co-author on this paper, and so maybe if the questions get too hard, we'll have her come in. Also, these views are ours. They're not the official views of any Federal Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so the question that we're going after in this paper is kind of a simple one. It's what drives labor markets over the business cycle, but we're going to focus mostly on labor supply. And I want to be clear, we're not discounting the role of labor demand. Labor demand is a key driver of employment and unemployment over the business cycle, but we're going to focus in on labor supply and provide some evidence that labor supply is countercyclical, at least on the margin, and perhaps it's more countercyclical than has previously been appreciated. So why should we care about labor supply? So that we have three reasons. The first has to do with measurement. So if we see employment fall during recessions or unemployment rise, this is an equilibrium outcome. If it's just a fall in labor demand, that's one thing. But if we have labor supply increasing during bad times and mitigating this fall in labor demand, it has implications for how large these shocks are that are changing labor demand, has implications for how wages might move. And you could even get real nerdy and talk about, the slope of the Phillips curve and so forth. The second is more about unemployment. A lot of central banks, we have this maximum employment mandate, and or at least in the U.S. But we talk about unemployment a lot. So what we're going to show you is that increased labor supply during recessions is actually causing unemployment to rise higher than if labor supply stayed constant. And so that's going to feed into how we interpret the cyclicality of unemployment and maybe how we think about policy decisions. The final thing is that we're going to show that this extensive margin elasticity of labor supply is pretty widespread. Seems to be like there's many workers on the margin of participation, and their choices are actually driving a lot of what we see in aggregates. So we're going to argue we should understand what's going on with these people, refine our theories of labor supply to understand why it's so elastic and so broadly so. Okay, so I'll just have a brief introduction, first telling you what we're going to show you in the data. We have evidence that labor supply is broadly countercyclical. And when I say broadly, I mean all workers, all people, no matter what their current state is, seem to be increasing labor supply during a recession. Employed workers, they're quitting less during recessions, and it's quantitatively important. This fall in quits is offsetting the higher layoffs that we see in a recession and causing total outflows from employment to be much less cyclical than if this quit behavior was, constant over the cycle. The second we find most interesting is these laid off workers. It seems like after a layoff, we have evidence that workers stay more attached to the labor force during recessions. So a laid off worker, they can go search in unemployment or they can exit. They exit less during recessions. And actually, this behavior is quantitatively important as well. 25 to 30% of the cyclical fluctuation that we see in unemployment is actually due to the labor supply of these laid off workers. And then finally, non-participants, this is a little bit more well known. They enter more during into the labor force during recessions, and sometimes this is called the added worker effect. It's an increase in labor supply of somebody who was out of the labor force during a recession. Okay, so what does this mean? We're gonna put together a model, a very, very basic model of labor markets, and we're gonna argue that our theory should be expanded in two ways. So the first is we're going to have some evidence that there's pro-cyclical income effects. What I mean by that is that people tend to feel poorer during recessions, and that could be the reason that people are increasing their labor supply. So in a search model with realistic participation flows and quits and layoffs, it's difficult to match this counter-cyclical labor supply. Not impossible, but I'll speak to it. For example, cyclical unemployment insurance helps. That's going to raise the labor supply of laid off workers. If you look at COVID times, these laid off workers definitely stayed attached to the labor force. They definitely wanted to collect the expanded unemployment. But that doesn't explain the decline in quits during recessions or the rise in entry, because those people usually aren't eligible for unemployment insurance. We're going to argue that income effects can do it, and risk aversion will help. They'll be complementary. And this makes sense. So we have prior work, and other people here have prior work as well, showing that secondary earners, women, they tend to quit less during recessions and exit the labor force. And we have all argued that this is a wealth effect. They're worried about their husband losing income, and so they stay more attached. It's also a reasonable explanation for people near retirement. They have these large asset portfolios, and if those fall in value during a recession, they might stay attached and work a little bit more, and so forth. We're also going to provide a little bit more micro evidence in this paper showing that this elasticity is particularly high for hand to mouth, so low wealth people for whom these kind of wealth effects would be very salient. But yet, it doesn't really seem to be the complete story. So, this is still work in progress, and I'm going to show you some facts about Black workers. So, Black workers, they're this type of worker that's kind of more elastic. They move in and out of the labor force quite often via quits, but they also are more likely to exit the labor force after a layoff. And yet, that behavior is completely acyclical for them. So there's lots of nuance in these marginal workers, which brings us to our next point is like we should probably understand the marginal workers. They seem quite different than the bulk of employment, but yet their choices are the ones that are driving what we see in labor supply on the margin. So we think that these laid off workers are especially illuminating because they would have probably kept working if they hadn't been laid off. But we're going to show you that actually 40% of laid off workers exit the labor force. And so, what does that mean for us? That means these 40% of workers either have a very small surplus of employment, so they'd be very elastic, or there's just this huge cost of searching for a job. And it seems pretty relevant to understand what's going on there so that we can understand aggregate. Okay, so I'll get right into the data. I'm skipping the literature review for time, but and I know lots of people here have worked on this, but I think it'll be clear when I go through kind of what our relative contribution is. So the standard way that the CPS has been used is to focus on this transition matrix, which many of us have seen. So we've been looking at flows between employment, unemployment, and non-participation, and you can make this little matrix that shows the share of workers, let's say, moving from employment across that top row to unemployment, non-participation, and who stay in employment. Now, the most used interpretation is that people moving between employment and non-participation are quitting. So they don't want to work anymore, they leave their job, and they exit the labor force. Another interpretation that's often been used is that if people go from employment to unemployment, they're probably laid off. They still want to work, but they lost their job, and so they're going to be looking for a new one. This is another way to think about it. If you go into IPUMS, you can easily see a little bit more. You can see if those employment to unemployment flows, was it a layoff or was it a quit? But you can't go into IPUMs and see if the employment to non-participation flows, if there are layoffs, or if there are quits. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to go into the micro data, harmonize them, and be able to make that separation. Okay, so how do we do that? Okay, there's a whole rabbit hole here, but the CPS actually has had these questions in it since the 1960s. There was this whole commission that added these questions to ask non-participants if they're why they lost their last job. And we're going to use the same questions that were first studied in Flame in 1973, who actually showed what we're going to talk about in this paper. So he showed that quits and layoffs are negatively or positively correlated with the unemployment rate. So he very early was after this countercyclical labor supply. Then in the following literature after that, there was more diving into these flows, looking at differences across different groups of workers, and also showing that the quit versus layoff distinction mattered for future outcomes. So it's not just people's emotions on how they answer a question, it actually matters for their future employment rates. Now, there was like even more commissions that called these sort of the lost flows of the CPS because they had issues with them. So they removed these series from being publicly released. But recently, there's been more interest in this, and a few papers have been putting the pieces back together and studying these flows. The advantages we think versus the JOLTS, which is another series that has quits and layoffs, is that we have a longer time series. The JOLTS goes back to about 2000. We go back to 1978. But then we can also see characteristics of workers and their labor supply decisions. So JOLTS follows jobs, CPS follows people. The problem or the difficulty is that the data were not harmonized by IPUMs. And so we're going to follow the standard sources of harmonization. And we're going to deal with the 1990s revisions in the standard ways. So our contribution is we're really trying to match what's been done previously with unemployment flows and expand those to non-participation. Now, part of this is you
Could I
can.
add something, Amanda? Is this a problem also for the SIP, or can you compute these flows in the SIP?
So I have computed them in the SIP, and actually at the end of this talk, that's where I'm going to talk about the hand-to-mouth people.
Yeah, because that's where you have the wealth. Okay, I'll
Mhm.
let you.
So I want to say, anytime we had to make a choice, we try to match IPUMs as much as possible so that it's not an issue with our methodology, these results. And part of this was training that Catherine took at IPUMs in like 2018, and all of those materials are online. So if you're interested in doing what we did, expanding on it, it's really, I wouldn't say it's easy, it takes work, but it's straightforward and it's well documented online.
Just a clarification, Amanda,
Mhm.
sorry. What do we know about the E to U's? Like, are they asked the same questions and how do you interpret those?
They're asked sort of the same questions with some a little bit of differences. So we're just going to use the standard IPUMS classifications for now, uh, saying whether they quit or whether they are laid off. So I'm not going to talk much about it. It's just we're trying to match that as best as possible. Okay,
Amanda,
so yep.
you're gonna make also a distinction between a mass layoff as opposed to a normal layoff because it seems that they have different implications for eligibility for UI. So that seems to be a margin that could be important.
Okay, so these are the questions that we're going to use. So I can show you right here the categorizations. To my knowledge, so unless Catherine tells me otherwise, I don't think we can see the difference between mass layoffs and individual layoffs. But we can see if it was a temporary or seasonal job, and we've done robustness of that, but I don't believe we can do what you're asking. So these are the categories that we make, how we classify the quits and the layoffs. Now, I want to say that this question is not asked to people who report that they're retired. And so sometimes, like in our paper, we have a category called other, but you should really think that that is a category of unknown. So those are quits or layoffs. They're not other. We just can't tell. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on prime age so that we don't have that unknown category. Okay, so here's the first fact, is that quits fall during recessions. So what you're seeing here is all quits, all layoffs in the CPS, no matter where somebody ends up. So you see, I'm going to look at the Great Recession for most of these things. It's something we lived through. It's something that's easy to see. And you can see that the layoff rate of workers from employment to non-employment rose from about 1 to 2%. And then quits fell from about 0.9, let's say, to 0.6. So these fall in quits are offsetting the rise in layoffs, but not completely.
If
Still, yep.
Sorry, probably you have it. If one does the lazy thing and only does it with the EUs and the only the EU flow, how much of the reality is gonna be lost?
Yep, I'll get there.
Thank you.
Okay, and then we see that the total separations, they look much less cyclical than total layoffs. So the quits are mattering. Another way to think about this, other than just looking at a graph, maybe we want something, a measure of recessions that isn't, the NBR dating committee. We can look at labor market tightness. And what you see is, except for COVID, the COVID recession, for example, quits increase as the labor market gets tighter, which makes sense. And to see how much they offset layoffs, you can see that total separations are almost flat with respect to market tightness. So this offsetting behavior is really important for understanding total flows in the labor market. Okay, so this is the second fact. There's only 2 facts here, and this is about laid off workers. So after a layoff, a worker, they can go to unemployment or they can exit the labor force. And what we're showing here is that during recessions, the share that stay in the labor force rises. So they seem to be more attached, be increasing their labor supply. Now, does this matter? That's always a good question. So we did this exercise where we looked at different recessionary episodes, and we kept fixed the share of workers exiting the labor force after a layoff and computed counterfactual rise in unemployment. So the top row is how much unemployment actually rose from trough to peak. And then the increase in the second row is what would have happened if this labor supply decision after a layoff was unchanged. And so what you see in the bottom row is kind of the contribution of these changes in labor supply after a layoff. And it's not trivial. It's, 25% or more of the rise in unemployment during these recessions is from people being more attached and not exiting the labor force after a layoff.
Hi, sorry, what accounts for the bracket that you have?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I had to make a decision about their exit rates from unemployment. And so
Okay.
the low one is as if they look like the people who actually, always went to unemployment. And the high one is kind of a calculation I have for the more attached of the non-participants. That's all.
Amanda, how do you think about Andy Miller's evidence that laid off workers are kind of better in unobserved dimensions in recessions? That might account for why they are more likely to stay attached. They're just kind of better workers. It's not necessarily something fundamentally about the recession affecting a given worker's likelihood of staying attached.
Sure. So there's a few things there. The first is we haven't completed our analysis of that yet, so I'm not going to really talk about it, but I'm sympathetic to that story. That's an alternative story. I do think it's a quantitative question. You can see, the wide variation, for example, in COVID, and then I'm a little skeptical that would be the entire story.
I see. Yeah, I mean, he kind of emphasizes that there are these kind of big shifts in the pool of unemployed workers over the recession in unobservable dimensions. So it might be maybe in the theory. I don't know if you're going to have unobserved heterogeneity in the theory, but that might maybe be nice at some point.
Yep, we're not going to have it today, but like I said, I'm sympathetic to this, and yeah, it's on the agenda.
Yeah.
Okay, so here is what Johannes was asking about, which is what would happen if you just use the classical view. So actually, this is kind of a funny thing. So if you're looking at prime age and you use E to U instead of layoffs, you actually don't do too bad. I will say it's kind of luck that this happens, but yes, you're not going to do too bad. You're going to miss a little bit. You're going to miss a lot actually in levels though, but not in cyclicality. What's more interesting is if you look at the quits versus the E to N.
So, sorry, Amanda,
Uh,
what is this table showing?
It's the correlation of each series with the unemployment rate. So we're not detrending here because there is a little bit of trends, but we're not detrending here, I will say. We've done some robustness with detrending, but it's just the raw series. Okay. So then the quits are very different than the E to N flows. So E to N is actually positively correlated with the unemployment rate, and that makes sense because there are more layoffs, and I always say this is an increase in labor supply on the margin. So that is conditional on what happens to you, but during a recession there are more layoffs, and a lot of laid off workers still move to non-employment or sorry, non-participation. So that's why you get that positive correlation. But if you look just at quits, you get a negative correlation. So people quit less when unemployment is high. Moreover, the share of layoffs that go to non-participation decreases. People who get laid off are going to increase their labor supply and stay in the labor force more. So you can't see those two on the right, the share of layoffs to N or the share of quits to N, unless you cut the data the way that we do. We've done a bunch of robustness. I'm not going to kill you guys with that today. But one note of robustness is, in the CPS, you have this bias where you're asked this week what you were doing exactly a month ago. And so we miss really short churns. So if you're unemployed for a week, we're not going to see you. Moreover, if you're laid off and you have advance notice that you're going to be laid off, you might make an E to E direct flow, even though you were laid off. And that's very likely to be cyclical. So what we did, and this is preliminary as well, but we've been working with a SIP, so we don't have the complete series yet. This is like 2014 to 2023, removing 2020 because it's crazy. And this allows us to look at all layoffs and all quits, even if they result in a direct employment flow or a very short spell of non-employment. And so what you see with the layoffs is, of course, they're going to be less cyclical. This is exactly what you might see in the jolts, for example, is that, during good times, laid off workers can just move to another job. During bad times, they cannot. And since in the CPS, we're only seeing those that cannot, it tends to exacerbate the volatility. Now, with quits, I would argue that these are two different concepts. A quit to non-employment is probably more about labor supply, whereas a quit from job to job is more about, maybe searching for a better match. But still, we find that all quits in the SIP are decreasing when unemployment increases. So they are pro-cyclical. Wait. Yes. And then we can do the same thing with the share of layoffs and the share of quits. And all I want to say is that the signs are all the same. So it's pretty robust to even this time aggregation bias or direct job-to-job changes. But we like the CPS because it's a little bit of a bigger sample and it lets us look at a longer time period and more up-to-date data. Okay, other types of robustness, we're looking at the prime age for the reasons that I talked about. It's more complete data. But if you look at the working age, you get similar patterns, different magnitudes, but still this counter-cyclical labor supply. Omitting temporary jobs doesn't really matter. So if you know Mariana Kudliak's work, temporary jobs are pretty acyclical in recent times. And so that doesn't really seem to be driving things. We can de-nullify the data in many different ways. We can look at different smoothing. It all kind of goes through. The other interesting thing that I want to say, so if you were trying to use the CPS and another approach to seeing if somebody quit or laid off who was in non-participation, you might try to use the activity that they report doing. But actually, we find that that doesn't provide nearly any information. So for example, when we see somebody go from employment to non-participation, 50% of them say that they are reporting family or family care as a main activity. And it's the same share, no matter if they were laid off or if they quit. So it's telling you nothing about whether that worker quit or was laid off. So you shouldn't see somebody taking care of family and assuming that they quit. They're equally as likely to have been laid off.
There are
So
probably no questions of the sort of what these people are expected to do, because I'm thinking about the quits, many quits as being associated with the future employment already lined up. So like people are looking for a job, they find a job, they quit because they already have a job, and maybe they take a month of non-employment just to take a break.
Yeah, so part of that we've looked at in robustness. I kind of filed it under denunifying, but we can also do it with requiring them to be in N for 2 consecutive months or 3, and it still goes through. Is there another question?
yeah, what about this? There's a question about people outside the labor force that get asked, would you work if you get offered a job? And I guess that I mean, yeah, just wondering if you correlated that to your measures.
We have not yet looked at that yet, but we could for sure. Chris?
Can I ask something related to what Katko and I think Nick earlier was saying?
Yep.
You have wage data here, right? I mean, wouldn't that be informative potentially?
Yeah, I agree. So this kind of goes back to Nick's question about the selection, especially selection over the cycle. So what we're currently working on is, looking at the wage data, but also looking at using some machine learning or propensity score matching to see the people who are likely to go to N. So, 2 measures of heterogeneity, one in terms of productivity and one in terms of attachment. We haven't done that yet, but yes, I agree.
Are you doing that in the SIP? I mean, the natural place, I guess, if you have a long enough panel, like kind of like Katka's work with Rob, is like how much of that's a person fixed effect? Maybe you could tease that out. I don't know. That's stretching SIP a long way, but
Yeah, I agree.
But even using like
I have another data question.
with the March CPS, right? I mean, you could get, at least that's what Andy does, right? You could get earnings, up to 2 years in the past, I guess, with the March.
Yeah, I'm totally on board. Again, I will say that the selection part we have not done yet, but these are all good points.
Fair enough.
Amanda, one more question about the data.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how conceptually distinct this concepts of quitting and a layoff actually is. So if you think about an employer that cuts a bunch of your benefits or makes you work, asks you to work a bunch more hours, I mean, that can be a way to basically induce a quit when you might want to, file that under layoff. And vice versa, if you think about quiet quitting, that could be a kind of way to where, what you should be reporting as quits are going to show up as potentially layoffs. Do you think that's a big issue or no?
So totally agree that this is what people report. So even if it's the employer, let's say, cutting hours, the worker might report that it was a layoff, even though, so there might be some disagreement. But what I've done extensively in the PSID, I can tell you, is that what workers report in terms of a quit or a layoff does matter for their job search behavior and for how quickly they go back to employment. Some of the papers that I cited earlier from the 70s, they're also using the CPS and showing that it matters for future outcomes. So, I mean, I'm not saying that there's no measurement error, but there seems to be a correlation with what people report happened to them and what happens to them in the future.
But building on that a little bit, Amanda, there's a question about that being a correlation in levels, but there's also concern about that correlation changing over the business cycle, right? So that what it means it might mean something kind of in levels, but it might kind of change how much that means in levels over the cycle and kind of offset potentially these differences that you're finding. Or more broadly, it's a little bit hard to know how much to make up about changes in outflows into a particular state without knowing anything about business cycle changes in the subsequent re-employment prospects of quits and layoffs?
Okay, so in the CBS, we can only do kind of the short panel thing, but I'm happy to provide more evidence in the SIP and in the PSID.
Can I ask one more
Amanda,
question?
sorry.
Sure. Yeah.
Maybe I missed this, but can you do this conditional on demographics? And do you see that kind of the demographic cells where quits go down are also the ones where layoffs go up? So is this, should we think of this as quits, like layoffs replacing quits, or are there some people who used to quit and they don't quit now, and there are some other people who weren't laid off and now they're laid off?
Yeah, so all of these questions kind of about the cross-section and different types of heterogeneity, I have some stuff at the end of this presentation, so I'm going to come back to them. Did other Lucas have a question?
Yeah. So I understand you denunify, but I mean, I'm thinking about some workers. There may be some workers who go into non-participation, but actually have strong intentions to rejoin the labor force, a few months down the line, and they just like, getting their things in order and they want to participate in job search again. And those, I guess, would be actual quits that you record as exits from the labor force, right? So they would be there would be quits into they're kind of like quits into unemployment, but you're counting them as if they're quits into like quits out of the labor force, and those should go down in recessions, right?
I'm not following. So give me an example.
So if you have a worker that actually intends to rejoin the labor force later, you kind of conceptually want to count them as being attached to the labor force. You see them.
Yeah, no, I don't actually. I follow the CPS, and are they looking for a job today, and do they want to find a job today? If they want to find a job a little bit later, I'm still going to count them as out of the labor force. Okay, so we do correct for the time aggregation. We have to extend Scheimer a little bit, and that's just because we have these new states. So we can see if somebody was employed and quit, and then where they ended up, and we can see if somebody was employed and then laid off, and then where they end up. But then we kind of have these two new states, which is like employed might quit, and employed might be laid off. So what we're going to do in order to do the time aggregation bias correction is we're going to make a few assumptions. The first is I'm just going to split employment into half people who are at risk of being quits and half at risk of being laid off. Doesn't matter what number I use. I could do 10%, 90%, doesn't matter. It's just a normalization. And I'm going to assume that they don't switch between states. So basically, there's a 1 in the EQ and a 0 in the EQ and so forth. All normalizations, but that's going to let us back out the flows that we need to make this a complete matrix and be able to turn it into a continuous time. Okay, so we do that, and then we're going to do the Scheimer decomposition, which is just assuming steady state in terms of unemployment, and then solving for the flow rates, the EUN, and computing hypothetical unemployment rates where only one of the flows varies at a time. Okay, that's unemployment. Okay, so we do that, and using our data, we can replicate Scheimer if we just look at the same flows that he did before. So that kind of gives confidence that this matrix that I'm making is not crazy. And then we can look at the same time period that Scheimer does, and we can do the decomposition, including quits and layoffs separately. When you do that, the main story that we want to say is the contributions of job finding goes down. The second thing is that if you expand the time series, we go to 2019 just to avoid COVID. Actually, you're going to find that in the longer time series, the UE flow contribution is even less. So one thing that we learn here is that now that we can distinguish quits and layoffs separately, there's more variation, and job finding is a little less important than we previously thought.
So EQ and EL here are into non-participation?
That's right. Well, I mean, it's the aggregation bias corrected, so it's non-participation, but it includes the really short spells.
Okay, but no quits into unemployment.
Actually, this does include quits into unemployment. Yeah, I'm just not talking about it much because it doesn't matter much.
That's a bit strange, right? Because in this decomposition, what you would want to know is like what is the contribution of one particular transition rate given all others held constant. But if EU, there's some transitions that are in two categories at once, that conceptual distinction no longer makes sense, right?
I think it makes sense still. You'll see that the sum of EQ and EL equals EEU. So it's just breaking up a flow into two additional flows.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so let's talk about models for a bit. So we think that the traditional view of recession, it's a period where the value of employment decreases. That's why people lose jobs. Okay. These facts that we're showing you, we think add nuance in a few ways. Basically, the quits decrease, the share of workers exiting decrease. So we want to have this labor supply action on the margin. So the question is, what does this look like in a pretty standard model, just to get us started? So we're going to follow Garibaldi and Wasmer-ish, just some small modifications. So we have our agents, risk-neutral firms, and workers. They're going to share a discount rate of the future. There's going to be two technologies. There's a market technology, which has an aggregate productivity Z, and then individual productivity Y, but that's same across everybody. And then there's going to be home production, which we will call B. There's 3 labor market states. Employed workers will get a Nash bargain wage. Unemployed workers will get their value of home production minus some search cost. And then the non-participant will get the full value of home production. The equilibrium is like a standard search model, wages Nash bargained, and then the market tightness is going to satisfy a zero profit condition. What's driving dynamics here? So for an individual, we're going to get growth flows by having home production follow a stochastic process. Now we're doing it with home production. We could have done it with individuals' market production. We could have done it many different ways. We just want to have some heterogeneity in the net value of employment. And this is kind of a simple way to do it. Job destruction rate and productivity could change over time as well. And then, of course, the job finding rate will respond to any aggregate shock. The value functions are just super standard. All the worker is choosing is the top ones if they're employed. So they're going to choose whether to stay employed. They could quit to unemployment or they could quit to non-participation. And then with the delta shock, they lose their job. And when they lose their job, they can choose unemployment or non-participation. The other thing that I will note is that the non-employed workers can't go straight back to work. They have to go through unemployment. And that's that's in a way a simplification in continuous time. The person who's a non-participant spends a second in unemployment at least before they go back to employment.
Just clarification, where's the productivity shock Z?
It is here in the aggregate. It's aggregate shock.
It's only aggregate. There's no match or other
No.
idiosyncratic realization.
No. So
shouldn't there still be an expectation operator somewhere?
It's this okay, I'm going to show you the steady state for now.
Okay, so no shocks here. No shocks to productivity.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay. So in steady state, there's 2 key thresholds. There's a quit threshold and an entry-exit threshold. So the quit threshold is if you have a job, at what point are you indifferent between continuing to work or quitting? And it's really trivial to show that if you quit, you're going to go to non-participation. Then there's the entry-exit threshold. So this is true. It's if a non-participant is going to want to go back to work, they first go to unemployment. But it's also the threshold that matters for laid-off workers. So they lost their job, employment's not an option. Do they choose non-participation or unemployment?
Amanda, just a clarifying question. You have Nash bargaining, correct?
Correct. Yep.
So now you have no distinction between. How can you make a distinction between a layoff and a quit?
Yeah, fair. So I'm going to call it a quit if it's a B shock, and I'm going to call it a layoff if it's caused by a shock to aggregate productivity or it's this exogenous job displacement delta. So, circling back to the discussion that we had during the empirical section, there's no selection into a layoff. And that could be something that people have a problem with. I would understand. Okay.
But also, if the whole contribution was to distinguish quits and layoffs, and the model doesn't have any meaningful distinction between quits and layoffs, that's a little bit of an unfortunate feature of the model. Maybe you can start from a different benchmark when the distinction makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that there's no meaningful distinction. One is idiosyncratic to the worker in some sense, and the other is more related to the
But
state of the economy.
but when the worker, what do you call a quit? When the worker quits, the firm also, the joint surplus is negative. So the firm also would not like to keep the worker around.
That's right. We can go through the arguments that I'm going to lay out here, and we can talk about whether they would look different in a different model. I think that they'll kind of look the same. So this is more qualitative at this point.
What's a layoff here now without productivity shocks?
So a layoff here without productivity shocks is only this job destruction shock, which is delta.
I see.
Okay, so key property is that there's this wedge between the threshold for a quit and the threshold for exiting after a layoff. It takes a higher shock to your value of non-participation for you to quit than it does for you to exit labor force after a layoff. And this is just like kind of a job hoarding property. You have the job, you're willing to give up more opportunity cost to keep it because it's costly to go find another job once you exit. This is what's creating our marginal workers. These are the ones that would have stayed employed and exit if they're laid off. And you can see that it's decreasing in the job finding rate. So this wedge is going to get smaller when jobs are easy to find. If you can get a job tomorrow, the wedge is 0. And it's going to be increasing in job destruction or in the search costs alpha. Okay, so this is kind of what it looks like if you just plot the net value of non-participation on the x-axis. And the blue guys are the ones that we've documented in the data have this cyclical property.
Okay, there are no quits into unemployment in this model, right?
No. So what features do we want to match? We want to match that a recession is when you have declining market tightness, falling quits, and a lower share of layoffs and non-participation. And so what you need for that here is you need both these thresholds to rise. So it takes a higher outside option to get you to move to non-participation. Now, the easiest way to do it is just to shift the curve, and we're going to argue that that's kind of something that we think is reasonable. In part because it's difficult to engineer this in other ways. So if we look at that entry decision again, these are the people who are choosing whether to stay in the labor force after a layoff. When you look at the job finding rate, it falls during recessions, makes you less likely to want to look for a job. If you think the job destruction rate rises, or if you think that productivity falls, that also makes the value of a job go down. So all of those reasons should be driving people out of the labor force. Now, you could have, a cyclical unemployment insurance, but there's a question of an empirical question, whether it's enough. Or you could have the distribution shift, which we think is a little bit more promising.
Amanda.
Yep.
Just a question on that. In terms of variations in B, I would expect only being based on UI, but you could also have a concern about financial constraints varying over the business cycle, right? It's like the likelihood you can get a loan to pay for your bills varies significantly over time, right? And that might actually keep people in the labor force if they think that, like, I can't get credit now.
I'm totally on board with that. So that's what we're going to argue is this shift in B, which would be consistent with an income effect. And I have some hand-to-mouth evidence in a little bit. That's good. Thank you. So then replicating the decline in quits, so you can also write out the decision rule for quits. So you can have, if productivity in the data is mostly acyclical, if it's procyclical, that makes you want to work less. If job destruction goes up, you want to, it could go either way. So really you need this fall in the value of non-employment. So lower job finding rates help, but there are some tensions. They're not going to help with, for example, this added worker effect of people moving from N to U. And so there's always kind of this feeling that you can't do it enough with the mechanics in a simple model. I'm going to skip that. One thing I wanted to show is, the job finding rate is the most promising for quits. It would have a higher job hoarding motive. But the fact that the red line, which is the share of workers to non-participation, it's going to move in the wrong direction. So you're always going to be fighting whatever you need to get these workers to stay in the labor force. They don't want to stay in when jobs are hard to find. But then the other thing is, I didn't say anything about the stochastic process for B. So the left panel is when there's no persistence. You're just drawing from a new distribution each period. And the right is when you have higher persistence, so 5 months. It's not crazy. And then I recalibrate the model to match aggregate flows and so forth in a reasonable way for both of these. The more persistent this B shock is, the harder it is to get a reaction to the job finding rate. So I again, this is not complete quite yet, but I don't think the job finding rate alone is going to be enough to match the decline that we see in quits. Okay, so missing elements, there could be some risk aversion, non-labor income, which is this wealth effect, or loans, or a spouse, or whatever. There could be worker heterogeneity, which we haven't explored fully yet. And there could be unemployment insurance. And that definitely helps decouple the quit and the entry threshold. But quantitatively, there's a question of whether it's enough. So going back to the data.
Amanda, I think wage stickiness of some sorts will help you here, because you're gonna get some people that are kind of happy to keep their job, and they're kind of feeling well paid because the wage is like not adjusting quickly downwards, especially. And then some others, for them, the productivity was so bad that they lose their job, and then productivity is so bad for them they don't even bother finding another job.
So the quit guy, the marginal guy who's quitting, is the one that gets the complete value of the match. So with the Nash bargaining, he's going to be paid the entire value because he's the one that's about to quit. So I don't know if the wage stickiness, I guess it would
decouple those two, and you would have a quit being separate from a layoff as well. They'd be sort of on opposite ends of the action region.
So I think something that will help with is there's another tension that I'm not talking about, which was just supply and demand shifts, is that you have to have like this really large shock to labor demand because we've shown an increase in labor supply to get a fall in employment. So sticky wages would help a lot there, where we can simultaneously have a rise in labor supply and a meaningful decline in labor in employment. So yes, yeah, that's true. Okay, the work that we've done with the SIP. So, like I said, we're not done yet. This is just going to be 2014, 2019 actually, and we're working on extending it further. But I computed like a hand to mouth, which is your liquid assets are less than a month of your household labor supply. And that'll be like 20% to 40% of the people, depending on which demographic I'm looking at. And what you see first is this odds ratio. So this is just to say, for example, when you look at exit after layoff, the hand-to-mouth guys, the guys who are really constrained, you might think financially, they have no savings, they're less likely to exit after a layoff. So they're very attached if they get this shock that happens to them. They need a new job. Now for quits, it goes the other way, and I don't fully understand that. The best thing that I can think of is some sort of reverse causality. Maybe you're hand to mouth because you quit a lot. You have family responsibilities or whatever's going on. So I don't know, but that's just in terms of the level. In terms of the cycle, we basically get what we want. So I tried to compute this as elasticity the best I could, and what doesn't matter is the magnitude, it's the relative magnitudes. So if you look on the rightmost column, it's the reaction of the people who are hand to mouth. And on the middle column, it's the reaction of the people who are not hand to mouth to a change in the unemployment rate. So everybody lowers their quit exits, but the hand to mouth lower their quit exits more. So it's kind of indicative that there is this wealth effect on labor supply. Moreover, the bottom row is a significant difference. The ones who are hand to mouth lower their exits more than the ones who are not hand to mouth if they get laid off. So they have a larger labor supply elasticity on the extensive margin.
So,
We also, yeah.
sorry, when do you exactly measure this hand to mouthness? Because there could be a very interesting windows where you might find effects, no?
Yeah, so in the later data in the SIP, we have decent asset. It's a higher frequency that they ask about assets. Earlier in the SIP, not so much. So I did it a couple ways. One is to use the most recent survey and whether they're hand to mouth then. The other is to look and only use people who do not change their hand to mouth status between the surveys. And you do lose some people, but the majority of people don't change their hand to mouth status. So I agree, there's some choices to be made, but it seems the general idea is pretty robust. Now, our past work, we do have an additional piece of evidence. So we've worked a lot with married women and secondary earners and their labor supply over the business cycle. And we found that married women whose husbands are in more cyclically sensitive industries, they're more likely to raise their attachment during a recession. And so the idea is here that the wealth effect is the risk my husband loses his job. And if my husband is a type that's more likely to lose a job, I adjust my labor supply more. So there's some promising things in the data on that front. Okay, so I'm almost done. I have two more things to show, and these are kind of more tangential, just kind of some insight into these data and some questions that could be asked. So, we're arguing that maybe when we think about models, we want to introduce some heterogeneity, especially in attachment, to understand what's going on with aggregate flows. And so we focus on two large groups of marginal participants. There's married women, which we've studied and other people have studied as well. And there's also Black Americans. Now, together, these guys make up more than a third of employment in the US, so it's not some really trivial groups. And the first graph down here on the left shows that they're the ones who are most likely to exit after a layoff. They're also the ones that are most likely to quit to non-participation. They're also, especially for Blacks, the ones that get laid off the most.
Sorry, these are Black men? Or
They're
all
Black.
But okay, so they could be Black married women, or you separate them, or?
So the CPS is a little bit too small to do that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
so that's why we did this.
Well, and I'll just, sorry, I just add that
yep.
Black married women are way more likely to work historically than white married women. So that might help your case that it probably doesn't matter as much.
I think, yep. So then the other thing is, so one, these are kind of like the marginal workers, and they're the ones that are really changing their labor supply over the cycle. Actually, if you look at married men, so the blue here is their quit rate. Married men actually quit more during recessions or when the unemployment rate's high. So actually they go in the wrong way for the aggregate. So it really is these other groups and large changes in these other groups that's driving the aggregate. Whoops. Okay, now this is just totally an aside. So some people, we also often get asked about the jolts. So I just wanted to show you our time series compared to the jolts. And what you'll see, this is the layoffs, is ours is more volatile. And I kind of discussed this when I pointed out the SIP. One reason that ours is more volatile is we only have layoffs that result in non-employment. We don't have layoffs that go quickly to a new job. So in a way, I think we are overstating the extent of layoffs in the economy. But we do have a different concept, which is layoffs, that result in unemployment. So there's something there. The other is quits. So on the left-hand side, I have CPS quits versus JOLTS quits. And there's something really interesting here, which is they follow each other pretty well until about 2018. And now they've pretty much decoupled. And especially for my Fed friends, if you're constantly talking about CES versus CPS, should we believe JOLTS? The response rates are so low. It's nice to have another series just to think about it. And then on the right-hand side, we added in the EDE series from Fujita, Mascarini, and Postel-Vinay. And a really interesting thing is that even when you add them together, we don't see this great rise in quits that you find in the JOLTS. So it kind of got us asking whether or not there really was this great resignation. It is true that in the Mascarini, Postel-Vinay, Fujita series, the EDE you cannot distinguish as a quit or as a layoff. But I will tell you, my preliminary evidence in the SIP in PSID is that I also don't see a huge increase in quits there. And in the CPS, if you look at tenure, something that you would expect to fall if people were quitting a lot, it hasn't really changed on average. Actually, the average tenure among all employed is exactly the same in 2022 as it averaged over 2010 up until the pandemic. So I'm not ready to quite to write this paper yet, but we're getting closer and closer the more data series that we see. I think it's very possible that the rise in quits that you see in the JOLTS is a little bit of an exaggeration. And so we're working on that as well. Okay, so kind of two chunks. Hopefully we've convinced you that labor supply increases during recessions, or that there's, a big change in selection, which we have not ruled out yet. We're trying to sell a story where we think that there's some wealth effects, that it's hard to get it just from the mechanics of a standard search model. And the other thing is, like, there's a lot of opportunities with the CPS. So as I said, it's not difficult to do what we did. It just takes some work, and all the material has been online for years. So it's not impossible if somebody's interested in this. But we think there's many reasons to be interested. If you care about following workers and not jobs, we really think that what happens to people after a layoff is insightful for marginal workers and their elasticities. And then again, if you care about CES and CPS, this is one way to try to reconcile them. And our aggregate series are online because we thought that they might be useful to people. And we update them monthly, so you have the real-time data. And that's it.
Excellent. Great, great stuff, great presentation. Okay, so folks, the floor is open to conversation. Feel free to ask Amanda and Catherine anything that comes to mind.
Amanda, since you mentioned all the differences between CS, JOLTS, and CPS at the end, did you guys take a look at multiple job holders? Right, people that have 2 or more jobs, do they have that different of a behavior compared to others to try to at least reconcile, or it's really an issue of sample size here and how the JOLTS actually declined recently?
Yeah, so the CPS does release a series that is the kind of like JOLTS equivalent CPS that corrects for things like multiple job holding and so forth. So we've done similar things, tried to make the same sample as well, and we still get this decoupling with quits. I don't know what's going on.
Amanda, there is a sense in which the relative importance of quits versus layoffs really depends on how persistent I expect the recessions to be, which can be subsumed in the expected dynamics of the job funding rate. So can you guys do anything about the relative contribution of these margins based on fast recovery from from COVID as opposed to the previous recoveries that are ways slower. In that sense, some of those statistics cannot be interpreted as, you know, some structural object that we want to replicate. It has to do with the type of recessions that we face and how workers expect how fast the recovery is going to be, so on and so forth. So I know that it's hard to disentangle these type of issues, but I was wondering whether you thought about it and what can be done and what cannot be done.
Yeah, so I should say, first of all, that everything that I showed from the simple model that we were using as a calibration for the Great Recession, just to be clear. So that was kind of a, you know, kind of a large recession and a lengthy one, especially in terms of job finding rates and even job destruction rates. So in terms of thinking about this, you know, one thing that we have done, especially in the paper, is like try to look at each recessionary episode and document them independently. We're also starting kind of a new project where we take more of like a new Keynesian approach and try to identify different shocks and maybe think about how the new data that we have can help identify those shocks. But that's work in progress. So that's all I can say at this point.
I have a more of a, I'm gonna feel free to disregard as too philosophical, but there is just, you know, the classic by Barrow that, like, you know, there is just a match and the incentives are between workers and firms most of the time, whatever they're aligned. This was, I think, Domenico's point about NAS bargaining. I just feel that the proper model to confront this may not be like an equilibrium vacancy creation NAS bargaining model, but more, or if you do it somehow, that, you know, the firms and workers should somehow disagree. The quit has the element that, you know, the firm wanted to keep the person left. Layoff is the other way around. I think, or maybe what Chris was saying, you need somehow wage that determination mechanism that is going to allow people to disagree on that. And I think it's going to be a great contribution, but or go partial equilibrium.
Yeah, it's kind of a little cheating that we build a straw man and say that it doesn't work. So I agree with you. Perhaps showing you something that does work will be a little bit more satisfying. Yeah, I agree.
Just a thought on this. I mean, you almost have a theory of quits versus layoffs, but just one missing ingredient in your framework, I see, which is asymmetric information about the outside option. That's Hall-Lazier 84. So right now, you know, in your model, the worker wakes up, they feel like they really want to stay at home. They go to their job, they say, give me a pay raise, please, because I really don't feel like working today. And they get the pay raise. In Hall-Lazier, that's an unobserved state. And so every once in a while, the worker will, on the equilibrium path, not get the raise and be let go. So that'd be like maybe a simple way of endogenizing it if you can handle the asymmetric information case. Wage stickiness seems like, or wage adjustment cost, let's say, seems like the other route. That's consistent with the recent work, it seems, by Mariana Kudliak and others. Some kind of cost of adjusting the wage, you know, even though there would be gains from trade.
Yeah, actually, my job market paper was about handling asymmetric information in business cycle models. So I might have the tools to do that. So yeah, we'll check that out.
Also, Amanda, you know, I worked on with the Garibaldi-Wasmer model for way too long, I would say, exposed. But,
okay.
And I, you know, and it was, so we had a fully stochastic model, we simulated the model, and if you only had productivity shocks, it was impossible to get the participation rate to fall during recessions, as we see in the data. If you only have shocks to B, now I don't recall all the details, but it was even worse. The only trick that quote unquote worked is to have the B, your B, to be correlated somehow with Z. Now, I was not proud of it because it was, you know, a little bit of a shortcut, but that quote unquote worked, at least to get the basic correlations of the flow rates, participation rate. Now, through the lens of the model, then it becomes a little bit odd to draw the dichotomy that you draw about B and Z as layoff induced by Z and quit induced by B, because it seems that that model per se, I wouldn't say it's the wrong model, no, all models are wrong, but there is something that model is fundamentally missing about aggregate dynamics in response to business cycle shocks. That goes beyond Nash bargain, I think. It's just that the set of equations that you just put, that model has, they have way too much of a hard time in matching the cyclical properties of the flow rates. So, this is just more like a comment than a suggestion. So, because I spent way too much time to get the model to work, and it was kind of successful, but I'm not really proud of the way we did it. But.
Yeah, we're finding the same thing, basically. So I guess you could argue that it's a little bit cheating if we say that quits and layoffs are negatively correlated, and then we provide a shock structure in which B and C are negatively correlated.
I wouldn't say it's cheating, but a little bit of overfitting, yes.
Yeah. I mean, one question is, quantitative, right? Like, what is the extent of that correlation that you need? That was more of why we were setting up kind of this simple model. Is not that we think that it's necessarily the way the world works, but to give us a quantitative sense of what that has to look like.
I think, I mean, not to make your job even harder, but there's another target that you're not even taking into account, right? Which is the share of quits that actually end up in unemployment versus non-participation. I mean, as you said, your model doesn't have quits into unemployment, so by design can't speak to that. But I guess it would be also kind of interesting to see if like what kind of model that can rationalize that sort of empirical movement.
Yeah, so the reason we didn't study them is because quits to unemployment are less than 10%, and they're basically acyclical. So since we're interested in the cycle, we didn't include it.
I wanted to piggyback on the previous question by Domenico that just asked, is that in working also with models that have this labor supply margin and trying to make it work as in the data is not easy, right? And we found, in work that I have with Shiro Fujita and Camilo Morales Jimenez, that incorporating the idea of Shodorov, Rage, and Karavaborny's paper about the cyclicality of the opportunity cost of employment, that the outside option moves a lot over the cycle, and you want to get out of the labor force when things are good in the economy, the other way, like it's counterintuitive. That help a lot in a model to bridge, the gap between the theory and the model. So if you want to go more quantitative with your theory, I think that just using their estimates about the cyclicality of the outside option could be a good way to say, okay, is this enough to kind of bring the model to the data, or that is not enough? So we found that cyclicality, together with wage rigidities that some people mentioned, was the two together were very powerful in bringing labor supply cyclicality, in the model, consistent with the data. So if you want to go more quantitative, that there is one way you could have some moments to target from empirical moments to target, yeah.
Yeah, to be clear, kind of what we see of our relative contribution is not a new theory. Like, there's lots of papers saying that labor supply is sometimes counter-cyclical, sometimes pro-cyclical, depending on if you're unemployed or employed, but it's more the extent. Like, we think this is much larger than what you saw when you just were looking at EAT and flows. So yeah, that's the name of the game. Is, I think you touched on it, is quantitatively, is it enough? And we expect to find no, basically.
Also, Amanda, sorry, again, Domenico. So this is a very nice paper that I read some time ago by Fujita and Gary Rame, where they show that actually it was the first paper that they was using actually the CPS to calculate to exploit the longitudinal component of the CPS and to calculate transition rates. And they also find that the contribution of separation rates to the aggregate unemployment rate was higher than the standard accounting exercise of Scheimer.
Yep,
so I guess you find the same, of course, but with your contribution is to dig deeper in this separations margin, quits versus layoffs. But I found that, so in that sense, your main results are consistent with that paper, that there's, I don't remember the details, but they do find that the contribution of separation rates actually is non-trivially larger than the 1/3 that Scheimer finds in the published paper.
Yes, correct. Yep. It's again, it's just how much larger, and I think we find it's a little bit larger.
Wait, I'm glad you mentioned that, Domenico, because I thought I saw that the contribution of the job finding rate is actually smaller, but I didn't see that. Maybe I didn't understand how you do it. Do you actually find the separations are more important? I thought it's more like is some other flows that contribute, and it's not the job finding rate dropped by maybe 10 percentage points or something, but obviously the separation margin increased to account.
So I don't have those numbers for you, so I'm not gonna
Okay.
I'm not gonna
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
But
So
we can compare. We should probably, instead of just having the column for Scheimer, also have another column for the Raimi Fujita paper.
nice, folks. Anything else? Maybe because we've already given folks so much extra work. So
No, like I said, in a way, we're kind of cheating by setting up a bit of a straw man. So it's helpful to hear your ideas of where to go from here.
it's nice that many of us that have worked with the
Yeah.
participation margin and search, all of us have struggled to make the thing work. So I kind of like, there's some common, bonding over that. No, that's great. Thanks very much. That was excellent. Dear panelists and participants, thanks very much. That was very nice conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.